You've never seen a man laughed at by a helicopter before. Femi hadn't moved in 11 minutes. Not since the ink dried on the divorce papers, not since Chloe's heel clicked past him on the courthouse steps without so much as a glance. Not since Carter, the man who now owned his wife, his ring, his name on paper, leaned down just to say, "Stay down, it suits you." So Femi stayed down, in the trash, in last week's coffee grounds and a stranger's fast food bag, with a wedding ring in his fist and dirt under nails that used to sign 9-figure contracts. Chloe laughed first. Carter joined a half-second later, the way rich men laugh at things they've already decided don't matter. It would have been the last laugh either of them ever got for free, if they'd known what was circling the block. They didn't, and that's the part they're going to regret. Here's what Chloe and Carter believed, in the 90 seconds before the rotors hit, that Femi had lost his mind somewhere around month 4 of living on the street, that his ramblings about the network were the fantasies of a man too broken to admit he'd failed, and that everything he'd built before his disappearance was now, legally and practically, up for grabs. Here's what was actually true. Every night on that pavement had been a data point. Every shelter, every corner, every person who'd ever stepped over him had been feeding the most valuable piece of software never filed with a patent office. Femi hadn't been losing a year. He'd been finishing one, on schedule, on budget, alone by design. The black helicopter now dropping onto the street wasn't rescue. It was a deadline. If you are new here, kindly hit that subscribe button. The year didn't begin with a plan. It began with a spreadsheet, 3 energy drinks, and a fight Femi couldn't remember starting. "You slept at the office again," Chloe said, not a question. She stood in the kitchen of their Denver condo, in a robe that cost more than his first car, arms crossed, watching him drop his keys on the counter, like a man returning from a war nobody had declared. "Aegis needed the overnight cycle," he said. "The data doesn't sleep, so I don't either. Neither do I, apparently." That was the shape of their marriage by then. 2 people orbiting the same rooms, never touching. Chloe wanted galas, a lake house in Aspen, her name in the society pages next to his. Femi wanted clean signal from noisy streets, and he was starting to understand those wants would never share a roof for long. He kept working anyway. Late nights blurred into gray Colorado mornings, his mind chasing patterns in shelter occupancy. Foot traffic, the small chaotic rhythms of a city nobody official bothered to measure. "Real data," he told his research partner, "doesn't come from clean rooms. It comes from cold sidewalks and broken traffic lights, and people the system forgets." If Aegis was going to protect the vulnerable, it needed to learn from the vulnerable, not from a lab in Palo Alto. So he started walking Denver's underpasses at 2 a.m., recorder in his coat pocket, notebook filling with numbers nobody else would ever read as poetry. The smell of diesel and rain-soaked concrete became familiar. Boots on wet pavement. A stranger's radio playing static 3 blocks over. He catalogued it all, where the cold pooled worst, which corners emptied first when police cars rolled through, how a single broken streetlight could rearrange an entire block's survival instincts. Chloe noticed the weight loss before she noticed anything else. Then the stained cuffs. Then, one Tuesday, the absence of any explanation she could repeat at dinner parties without embarrassment. "You're choosing this," she said, months later, suitcase already packed, her voice flat in a way that scared him more than shouting would have. "Some algorithm, some app nobody's even heard of." "It's not an app. I don't care what it is, Femi. I care that you left me for it a long time before you actually left." He didn't argue. He never argued well when he was right and losing anyway. The door closed behind her that night, with a sound so ordinary it barely registered. A click, a draft. Silence settling into a condo built for 2. He stood alone in the dark, notebook still in his hand, and understood exactly one thing. The real test hadn't started yet. The penthouse felt too large after a year of doorways he could touch both sides of. Femi stood under the shower longer than necessary, watching a year of grime spiral down the drain in grey ribbons, and still felt unclean in some place water couldn't reach. Elias had given him 3 days before the board expected results. Femi had used one of them to sleep, one to eat real food without his stomach rebelling, and now, on the third, he sat before the Aegis mainframe in a robe he barely recognized as his own, hands trembling slightly from months of poor nutrition and worse sleep. The system booted, the way it always had, clean, silent, obedient. He ran his fingers across the keyboard like a pianist, testing an instrument after a long absence. Then he saw it, an access log, time-stamped from 4 months into his disappearance. A login using Chloe's old credentials he'd never bothered to revoke, because revoking them would have meant admitting the marriage was truly over. Someone had used her name to walk straight into the Alpha build, the earliest, most unstable version of Aegis, the version that could still be twisted into something dangerous if it fell into careless hands. Femi pulled the access trail further. Denver server, then Chicago, then a shell company registered out of Manhattan, with a name so sanitized it might as well have been invisible. He traced it anyway, the way he'd once traced heat signatures through abandoned buildings on frozen January nights. 3 keystrokes later, the name behind the shell company surfaced. Carter. He said it out loud, just to hear how it sounded in an empty room. It sounded like betrayal, wearing a tailored suit. Carter, the venture capitalist Femi had met exactly twice, per times at industry dinners where the man had asked pointed questions about Aegis's architecture while pretending not to care about the answers. Carter, who was apparently close enough to Chloe now to inherit her old passwords along with everything else that used to be Femi's. The files told the rest. A pitch deck, still in draft, branded Omnisite. Femi's algorithm, his year of frozen nights and catalogued suffering, repackaged with a sleeker logo and language about predictive civic intelligence that made his stomach turn. No mention of shelters, no mention of the people he'd slept beside. Just projected revenue and a launch date 3 weeks out at a summit in Dubai. Femi sat back, the chair creaking under him, city lights from the window throwing pale rectangles across the floor. They hadn't just stolen code, they'd stolen the meaning out of it, hollowed it into a product. He opened a blank document and began typing notes. Not panic, not yet. Something colder, something closer to the discipline that had gotten him through 365 nights on concrete. If Carter wanted a launch, Femi decided, he would give him one, just not the one he was expecting. The first glitch was small enough to be a coincidence. Carter's smart display, the one mounted above his kitchen counter in the Cherry Creek high-rise he now shared with Chloe, flickered for exactly 2 seconds and displayed a single line of code before returning to the weather forecast. He blinked at it, coffee halfway to his mouth, and decided he'd imagined it. He hadn't. Femi worked from the penthouse in careful, patient sessions, each one shorter than the last, each one leaving less of a trace. He didn't touch the stolen Alpha build directly. That would trigger alarms Carter's security team was competent enough to catch. Instead, he worked the seams, the forgotten back doors he'd built into his own architecture years ago for testing. Small doors nobody else remembered existed because nobody else had built the house. A misspelled word in a beta test summary, corrected to spell out 3 letters that meant nothing to Carter, but everything to Femi. A projector in a boardroom that briefly displayed a shelter's coordinates instead of a revenue chart before self-correcting. Nothing large enough to prove sabotage. Everything large enough to notice. Did you see that? Carter asked one evening, staring at his phone like it had said something threatening. See what? Chloe said, not looking up from her own screen. The Omnisite dashboard. It showed a name for a second, gone before I could read it. You're tired. The launch is in 2 weeks. Of course you're seeing things. But Carter wasn't seeing things, and some quiet animal part of him knew it. He started sleeping with his phone across the room, started asking the engineering team redundant questions about server logs, questions that made them exchange glances behind his back. The confidence that had carried him through boardrooms full of skeptical investors began to erode one flickering screen at a time. Chloe noticed the erosion before she understood its cause. "You've barely spoken tonight," she said, watching him check the locks on their door for a second time. "Someone's in the system, Chloe." "Nobody's in the system. Femi's homeless, or he was." Carter turned to her slowly. Was. The word sat between them, heavier than either wanted to admit. Chloe felt something cold move through her chest, that she didn't have a name for yet, something adjacent to guilt but sharper. "He wouldn't," she said, though she wasn't sure anymore what Femi would or wouldn't do. The man who'd once been too obsessed with his work to notice her leaving didn't feel like a man who'd stay quiet about theft. Outside their window, Denver's skyline blinked on, indifferent and enormous, holding a truth neither of them could see yet. 3 floors below, in a rented office with blackout curtains, a man they'd left in the gutter was watching every flicker land exactly where he wanted it. The address Femi gave the cab driver wasn't a boardroom. It was a diner off Colfax Avenue, the kind of place with laminated menus and a bell over the door that hadn't rung true in years. 3 people waited in the back booth. Femi recognized all of them, though it had been months since he'd seen any face that wasn't reflected in a dark monitor. Deshawn sat closest to the wall, hood up despite the heat, fingers drumming against a phone screen cracked in 3 places. Femi had found him half frozen under an overpass the previous February, feverish and alone, and had walked him to a shelter through sideways snow. Beside him sat Aishat, older, sharper-eyed, a woman who'd once run cybersecurity for a firm in Austin before an addiction and a divorce had cost her everything except her instincts. Femi had gotten her into a program in March. She'd been clean since. The third, a wiry man named Otis, said nothing at first, just studied Femi like he was still deciding whether the suit was a costume. "You clean up nice," Otis finally said. "Doesn't feel like it," Femi answered, and something in his tone made the table relax slightly. He laid it out plainly. Carter's servers sat in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, 3 floors of biometric locks, and a security team that rotated every 6 hours. Getting the core IP back meant getting inside physically. The network itself was air-gapped, untouchable from a distance, which was exactly why Carter felt safe. "Air-gapped from smart people," Aishat said, already pulling a laptop from her bag. "Not from someone who used to sign the purchase orders for the hardware." Femi almost smiled. She wasn't wrong. He still remembered the vendor contracts, the model numbers, the exact make of the badge readers he'd chosen himself 2 years earlier for cost efficiency. "I need a service crew," he said. "Havoc. Maintenance. Something boring enough nobody double-checks the paperwork." "I know a guy in Newark does exactly that route," Otis said. "Owes me. Owes you more, actually. You got his sister out of a bad situation last October." Nobody at the table treated the debt as sentimental. It was simply fact, the currency of a world Femi had lived in longer than he'd expected to survive it. They spent the next 2 hours drawing floor plans on napkins, timing badge rotations, arguing over which floor held the core servers versus the decoys. Aishat's fingers never stopped moving across the keyboard, building a small piece of software that would ride quietly on the maintenance crew's tablet, invisible until it needed to matter. By the time they finished, the diner's dinner rush had come and gone, and rain had started tapping against the window in an uneven rhythm. "1 shot," Aishat said, closing the laptop. "You understand that?" Femi nodded, already picturing the Brooklyn warehouse, its guarded doors, and the version of himself Carter still believed was broken. 1 shot, he agreed. "Let's make it count." The Burj Al Arab's ballroom glittered like something built specifically to make ordinary people feel small. Chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors, and waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne that cost more per glass than most people's rent. Carter stood near the stage in a suit tailored close enough to look poured on, shaking hands with investors from Singapore, from London, from firms whose names alone could move markets. Chloe stayed at his side in gold that caught the light every time she turned, laughing at jokes that weren't especially funny, playing the role she'd always wanted. the woman standing beside power instead of behind it. "You look nervous," she murmured to Carter between introductions. "I look focused," he said, though his eyes kept drifting toward the ballroom's edges, scanning shadows out of a habit he couldn't explain even to himself anymore. He had reason to be careful. The glitches had stopped 3 days earlier, sudden and total, and the silence unsettled him more than the interference ever had. Quiet, he'd learned during his year in finance, usually meant something was loading. Femi entered 40 minutes later, and nobody looked twice. That was the point. Gone was the beard, the ragged coat, the man who'd sat in refuse outside a Denver courthouse. In his place stood someone in a charcoal suit that fit like a second skin, hair cut close, expression unreadable. He carried a tablet, like every other tech executive in the room, badge clipped neatly to his lapel, a badge Aishat had built from scratch 3 nights earlier, cloned from a mid-tier sponsor's credentials. He didn't approach the stage. He didn't need to. Instead, Femi drifted toward the service corridor near the kitchen, earpiece nearly invisible beneath his collar. "Status," he said quietly. Deshawn's voice crackled back from 6,000 miles away, sitting in a rented office above a laundromat in Newark. "Maintenance crews inside the Brooklyn warehouse. Aishat's got a live feed on the core servers now. We're seeing alpha build architecture confirmed." "Copy that," Femi said. "Hold position until my signal." Across the ballroom, Carter took the stage to applause that rolled like a wave, thanking investors for their faith in the next evolution of civic intelligence. Chloe watched from the front row, champagne untouched in her hand, unable to shake the feeling that something in the room had shifted without her permission. She scanned the crowd once, twice, some old instinct pulling her attention toward the shadows near the kitchen doors. For half a second, she thought she saw him, a man in a dark suit, watching not the stage, but something on a screen in his palm, calm in a way that felt deliberate. Then a waiter crossed her line of sight, and when he passed, the shadow by the doors was empty. She told herself it was nerves. She was wrong. The VIP lounge sat 1 floor above the ballroom, glass walls overlooking the Gulf, quiet enough that the party below sounded like a memory rather than an event still happening. Femi had come up for 2 minutes of stillness before the next phase began. He hadn't expected company. "I knew it was you," Chloe said, closing the door behind her. She looked older than he remembered, though it had only been a year, or maybe it was just the first time he'd looked at her without exhaustion clouding his vision. "You look well," he said, and meant it as fact, not kindness. "Don't." She crossed the room, heels silent on thick carpet. "Don't do the calm thing. I know what calm means with you. It means you're already 3 steps ahead and enjoying watching the rest of us catch up. You cornered me, Chloe. I'm just standing here." She studied him for a long moment, searching for the man who used to forget dinner, forget her birthday, forget which year it was, some Tuesdays, because a line of code had eaten his whole week. She didn't find him. Something colder had replaced that man, something that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "I can offer you something," she said finally. "A settlement. Quiet. You walk away. We credit you as a consultant. Everyone keeps their dignity. A settlement. 2 million. Carter agreed to it this morning." Femi almost laughed, and the almost was worse than if he had. "You still don't understand what you stole. It's an app, Femi. A very valuable app. That's all it needs to be. It's not an app." He said it the way he'd said it to her a dozen times before she left, except now, there was no plea underneath it. Nothing left asking her to understand. The alpha build has a fatal flaw in its predictive weighting. I know it, because I put it there. I left it unprotected on purpose, because I knew whoever took it would be too impatient to check for a trap. Chloe's face shifted, confidence sliding into something rawer. What kind of flaw? The kind that activates under live load. The kind that turns predictive protection into predictive targeting the moment it processes real population data at scale. He watched her closely. "Carter's launching that tonight, in front of investors, in a room full of cameras. You're lying." I don't need to lie anymore, Chloe. I stopped needing anything from you the day you slid those papers across the table. Her hand had started trembling, champagne long forgotten somewhere downstairs. Fix it. Whatever it is, fix it before he goes live. Ask me nicely, Femi said, and we'll see. Chloe stared at him, searching for leverage that no longer existed, and found only her own reflection in the glass wall behind him. Small, gold, and suddenly very afraid. The ballroom lights dimmed for the demo, and Carter's voice filled the room, smooth and rehearsed. Tonight, we don't just introduce OmniSight. We introduce the future of civic protection. Live, unfiltered, running on real data. Behind him, 3 enormous screens waited to display the proof he needed. Proof that would close every check in the room before dessert was served. In the service corridor, Femi watched the same feed on his tablet, one hand steady on the interface, the other pressed lightly to his earpiece. Aishat, we're live in 10 seconds. Core access confirmed, she said, voice tight with focus. You've got the master key. Say when. When, Femi said. Carter raised his hand toward the screens with the confidence of a man who'd never once doubted his own timing. Watch the network respond to live population data across 3 test cities. The screens flickered. For half a second, nothing changed. Then the polished OmniSight interface dissolved into something rawer. Dense, architectural, unmistakably older. Aegis. Femi's real interface, the one he'd built alone on cold nights with numbers nobody else had bothered to collect. A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Carter turned toward the screen, smile faltering. There's a technical issue. We'll resolve. There's no issue, Femi said, and the room turned as one body toward the sound of his voice. He walked from the shadows into the light, without hurrying, every step measured, tablet still in hand. Chloe, seated near the front, went rigid. My name is Femi, he said to the room, calm cutting cleaner than any shout could have. And what you're looking at is stolen code, built from a year of data I gathered myself, living on the streets of Denver, so this system could actually protect people, instead of surveilling them. This is absurd, Carter said, stepping forward, voice climbing. Security. Before you call anyone, Femi continued, unmoved, you should know OmniSight has a predictive flaw that activates under live load. Right now, if it processed real city data, it wouldn't protect anyone. It would target them. Watch. He tapped the tablet once. On the screens, a simulated map bloomed red across 3 city grids. Vulnerable populations flagged, not for aid, but for isolation. A surveillance net, dressed as a safety net. Gasps rippled through investors who understood exactly what they were seeing. I built the fix, Femi said. I also built the lock. Another tap, and Carter's access credentials blinked, then failed, across every terminal in the building. You don't have either anymore. Carter stood frozen under lights that no longer flattered him, mouth open around words that wouldn't arrive. Femi turned to the stunned room, voice quiet enough that everyone leaned in to hear it. Real innovation doesn't come from theft, he said. It comes from actually knowing the people you claim to protect. Behind him, the screens held steady on Aegis's true interface, patient and undeniable, while 3 floors below in Brooklyn, the last of the stolen servers went dark for good. 6 months had passed since the ballroom in Dubai, and Denver had turned cold again, the same kind of cold Femi once measured in notebook pages instead of degrees. Carter's trial had started in September, federal prosecutors laying out corporate espionage charges with the same polished confidence he'd once used to court investors. The financial network that had backed OmniSight collapsed within weeks of the summit, taking his reputation down with it. What remained of his empire fit inside a single storage unit outside Manhattan, everything else frozen, seized, or simply gone. Chloe fared no better. The social circles that once welcomed her gold dresses and easy laughter had closed ranks the way they always did when scandal threatened proximity. Her name appeared in filings now instead of party pages, Tied to a bankruptcy nobody wanted their photo taken near. She'd called Femi twice after Dubai. He hadn't answered either time, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't just be cruelty dressed as closure. Femi, meanwhile, had spent the months rebuilding something larger than either of them understood. He stood now in a converted foundry space south of downtown Denver, exposed brick and steel beams overhead, the smell of hot metal still clinging faintly to the air from the building's old life. Around him, a small team worked at terminals arranged in a loose circle rather than rows, engineers and former outreach workers, and 2 people he'd met on the streets during his year undercover, all of them building the next version of Aegis together. It launched publicly that morning as an open-source, community-governed trust, ownership distributed among the cities and shelters and outreach programs that had unknowingly trained it in the first place. No single name attached to the patent, no boardroom controlling its direction, just code. Finally free of the hands that had once tried to weaponize it. Elias had called an hour earlier, gravel-voiced and satisfied. The board's calling it the most important thing tech's done in a decade. The board's late to the party, Femi had said, and meant it kindly. Now, alone for a moment near the foundry's working furnace, Femi reached into his coat pocket and found the ring he'd carried through gutters, penthouses, and boardrooms without quite knowing why. He turned it once between calloused fingers, catching the last of the firelight along its edge, then let it drop. It hit the flame and was gone in seconds, swallowed into something too hot to hold shape. Femi watched until there was nothing left to watch, then turned back toward the terminals, toward the team waiting on his signal, toward a system finally built to protect the people who'd once looked past him without seeing him at all. Behind him, the furnace kept burning, steady and patient, warming a room built to make something new. Thank you for listening to this story till this point. If you are new here, kindly subscribe. I drop stories like this every day,